Hi, I'm Nerdic of the Nerdic Translator quote-unquote fame, and one of my passions in life is introducing beginners to new and sometimes complex topics, providing answers to all your burning questions. And in this, my third video as Nerdic, I have already failed. Sometimes, all I can do is break down the question in a way that accurately conveys the reason for my suffering, so you can all suffer too. What counts as an indie game? Hell if I know, but I'm about to hazard a moderately educated guess. Why does any of this matter? Well, I'm making indie games and writing my whole shtick for the foreseeable future, so how I classify indie games matters to the literal future of my channel, and my identity as a VTuber. There are a few common definitions of quote-unquote indie game, and they're all wrong, or at least hotly contested. I want to go over some of them to start with, and then I'll get into my own ideas about all of this. I've got some fresh beverage, TM, and a snack, some indie game B-roll in the background, and a renewed hatred for video game industry taxonomy. Let's do it. Oh, and the game in the background is Spilled by Lente, I think that's how you say it, on Steam. It's a chill game about cleaning up bodies of water, and if you want something relaxing to play for an hour or so, I recommend it. Chapter 1. All the flawed definitions of indie. Let's be clear, the definitions of indie aren't flawed because the people who came up with them are dumb. The definition of indie game gets complicated because the games industry is complicated. And everybody's got different ideas of what indie means. One common definition is simplistic and seemingly self-explanatory. If a game is published by one of the big publishers, then it can't possibly be indie, right? But which publishers are the big ones? Ubisoft, EA, Take-Two Interactive, that sort of thing, right? Sure, but where's the cutoff point? How big does a company have to be to lose its indie status? How much money are they allowed to make before they're one of the big boys? Cloud Imperium Games, the developer and publisher of the, let's just say, unfinished game Star Citizen, has raised $800 million in funding as of April 2025. It is unconnected to any of the usual major publishers, and is in fact self-publishing both Star Citizen and Squadron 42. By this definition, I have jokingly called Star Citizen an indie game online, and while some people laugh, others really hate that idea. And think of Larian Studios too. Where were they indie when they were crowdfunding their Divinity Original Sin games? Oh hell yeah! Are they indie now that Baldur's Gate 3 grossed over $1 billion estimated, and left the studio themselves with a tidy sum of over $500 million estimated in net revenue? Given that they've left the D&D franchise behind, and I suspect Wizards of the Coast must have been an unholy nightmare to work with for Larian to just leave, and they're going back to their own projects, I'd argue that yeah, they're still indie. Others say that it's a matter of self-publishing. Any game that's self-published gets to be indie, Star Citizen included. These people may have mixed feelings about the whole concept of indie publishers, mind you. If you're a games industry newbie, that's right, there are whole-ass companies which specialize in working with indie studios to handle the publishing side of things, which is admittedly a lot of work. And plenty of games that have been widely celebrated as triumphs of the indie space were published by separate companies, by indie publishers. Personally, I feel that defining indie games as self-published alone is a bit limiting. And truthfully, I don't think too many people subscribe to this definition. There's just far too much momentum behind indie publishers for that to be a widespread view, and it puts some of the most creative, wild, and unbrand safe games you can imagine into the same category as your Calls of Duty and your Candy's Crush. Side note, Candy Crush is anything but indie, and it's arguably kind of AAA. Look, when Microsoft bought Activision Blizzard King, Activision and Blizzard were just nice bonuses. The mobile game money-making machine that is King was arguably the real prize. Anyway, this is where we come to the third common definition of indie games. There are people who say it's all about control. Indie publishers get to call themselves indie because all they do is publish what developers build. They don't control what kinds of games the developers are allowed to make. They don't own the developers, and so those devs are truly independent. The devs get free reign to make their wildest ideas come true, and that's how we've gotten this massive catalog of fantastically weird and obscure experiences that we love so much. Basically, they're indie as long as they can do what they want. I think this definition is the closest to being accurate, but I feel it may be incomplete. I think we can go deeper. I'll get into that, but first, another concern. What happens when the aforementioned big boys get involved in the indie space? For a while there, the EA Originals label was all about indie games. Ostensibly, they acted like any other indie publisher, publishing the work of indie studios with little to no interference in the actual creation of the game. They've now expanded to include some non-indie games, but it was apparently an indie publisher once, even as it was owned by EA. This concept came under some scrutiny when Dave the Diver ended up in the running for a number of indie game awards. No one contests the idea that the game is, in fact, very good. The problem is that it was both developed and published by Mint Rocket. Mint Rocket bills itself as the indie publishing arm of Nexon. And Nexon is indie the same way that Amazon is a small family business. And no, just because some people call Jeff Bezos daddy doesn't make them a family. Nexon is indie the way golf is interesting to watch. Nexon is indie the way my dad has been a present and reliable part of my life ever since he went to get milk and cigarettes when I was 4. Anyway, a lot of people took exception to Dave the Diver being classified as an indie game, perhaps rightfully so. Where the EA Originals at least had that separation between the developer, the publisher, and the even bigger publisher that is EA Classic, Mint Rocket doesn't even have that. It's the publisher, it's the developer, and it's owned by Nexon. I, like many others, have trouble believing that a developer can be truly independent in those circumstances. Then again, having seen the rest of Nexon's catalog, the fact that Dave the Diver is as amazing as it is, and not drowning in a crap tsunami of microtransactions, it might be indie? And now you see the problem people have been running into. Like I said, everybody's got their own idea of what counts as indie, with various nuances adding to the basic definitions I've presented so far. And now we come to my own opinion on the matter. It's probably all about money. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. For now, if you could, subscribe, hit the bell notification icon, etc., I'd really appreciate that. Okay, moving on. Chapter 2, a possibly more complete definition of indie games. If you'll forgive me for going on a bit of a side tangent at this point, I need to give you a little background information. A while ago, I was having a different video game industry taxonomy discussion over on Blue Sky, and I personally think I struck gold. People were discussing what counts as a live service game. Is it the online multiplayer features mixed with endless microtransactions? Is it the ever-ongoing updates? Wait, the Hoyoverse games are largely single-player, right? So single-player games can definitely be live servicey in all the wrong ways. And the thought that came to me was this. Live service has little to do with the game itself. How it was made, how it operates, the way you play it, all of these things don't matter. What makes a game live service is the publisher's intentions. If the plan is to make a game, maybe add a few content updates, then move on, it's not live service. Even Call of Duty and Assassin's Creed aren't live service, in my opinion, just greedily monetized. Side tangent, this brings us to the question of whether or not there's such a thing as a live service franchise, or if that's just the nature of franchises. I'll deal with that in another lifetime. No, true live service is when one game is intended to be kept alive forever, or at least for an indeterminate amount of time, as an endless money printer. Some companies build these games intentionally, while others sort of stumble into them. Some live service games are even rather benign, like Deep Rock Galactic. Yes, it's live service, but its content offerings are more than fair, and it's rare that any player would feel like they're being price gouged. The important point is that live service isn't a type of game, it's a monetization strategy. In the end, it's about the money. And maybe this can apply to our definition of indie games. You see, with that third definition of indie games that I mentioned earlier, where it's about whether or not the developer has true creative control and freedom, we can go deeper. After all, what motivates a publisher to curtail the creative freedom of the developers they own/control? Money, of course! To be more specific, it's the demands of shareholders. You see, every developer and publisher wants to make money. It's how they keep the lights on, and pay employees to stick around and do their jobs. That's fine. But there's a big difference between a company that wants to make money and one that has a legal fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. A privately owned company may intentionally decide to eat a loss or two for the sake of art. A publicly traded company doesn't have this option. They are required, by law in some places, to do everything in their power to make the line go up, constantly, at all costs. And the first cost is usually creative freedom, as investors prefer to make safe choices, rather than see if, for example, a roguelike poker game might be the next big thing. So when it looks like a developer's creative choices might cost them a buck or two, or just not make as much money as they'd like, publishers are wont to step in and make a few course corrections. At this point, you might be wondering if I'm implying that any publicly traded developer or a developer with a publicly traded publisher can't be truly indie. And the answer is a solid maybe not. I honestly don't know if it's quite that black and white, but it's no secret that when companies go public, they usually get a lot worse from the perspective of their customers and often their business partners too. And does this apply to companies that have outside investors without being publicly traded? Can they be indie? It probably depends a bit on the investor, but in the end, they all want to get their money back and then some. But then it's still not that simple. Yes, investors of all kinds can apply outside pressure that affects creative decisions. However, even developers with no investors can experience outside pressure that affects creative decisions. That pressure just comes from other things like an urgent need to pay the rent, or a natural disaster, or a war, or an ill-timed and ill-conceived trade war. Or one of the devs could suddenly have to leave the project due to a family emergency or what have you. That said, there's a difference between those different kinds of outside pressure. The kind brought on by investors is intentional, designed to improve their own bottom line, and on occasion it's even malicious. Putting that bit of complexity aside, there's also the question of the fallout, I suppose. Declaring that a developer or publisher being publicly traded denies indie status to a game would disqualify, well, a lot of games. It would disqualify games from the EA Originals program, and it would certainly disqualify Dave the Diver. But it would also disqualify, like, any Devolver Digital published game that came out after 2021, which is when Devolver Digital held its initial public offering. Yes, it's still mostly owned and therefore controlled by its founders, but it's now also partially owned by the likes of NetEase, Sony Interactive Entertainment, and Quali. Devolver Digital now has an obligation to make the line go up for all of its investors. If you extended this criterion to include any sort of external investment, you'd have to say that indie darlings like Balatro aren't indie games, and that honestly feels like the kind of logical stretch that would make Mr. Fantastic nervous. I'm personally definitely not ready to write Devolver off as a non-indie publisher. I have yet to hear about the slightest inkling of anti-consumer or anti-developer behavior from them, and I hope it stays that way. But now you see why I hate video game industry taxonomy. Even my own best effort to come up with a better definition of indie games falls painfully short. Of course, with my luck, some genius will pop into the comments and tell me exactly how I got everything wrong and come up with the perfect solution. That would be embarrassing, and I'd hate that and also really useful, so do it if you can, please. I'm still right about my definition of live service, though. Chapter 3. Where in the hell do I go from here? I said at the beginning that the future of my channel depends in part on my ability to decide what is or isn't an indie game. I'm going to have to do something truly awful, horrible, and messy to get this done. I'm going to have to go with my gut. I'm mostly going to leave the coverage of super huge budget and popular games to other people. But budget isn't my only concern. I want to cover games where it's clear that their creators were let off the leash and let out to play. I want to cover games where the artists, writers, programmers, voice actors, and everyone else got to go wild and have some fun. I want to cover the little games that leave their creators saying, "Hell yeah, I can't believe I got to make that and now it's out in the world." Why? Because you can tell. You can tell playing a game, reading a book, or watching a film when it's a passion project, a labor of love and fun. It feels good to be part of that, if only for a while, and to share it with the world. I won't only ever cover indie games, but indie games are the most likely to give me the experience I've outlined above. Also, I know what it's like to pour your heart and soul into a thing and have no one even look at it, so I want to help promote indie games where I can. So I'll look around on Steam, check out the companies that made games that look cool to me, and when determining whether or not they're indie games, I'll hazard a moderately educated guess. Stay tuned for the next time when I tackle the question of what is AAA? No, I'm not going to touch that discussion with a 10-foot pole. No, never. You can't make me. And that's the end for this video. Again, please consider hitting all the buttons and doing the things that help others to find my channel. I'm trying to upload something related to either indie games or writing at least once a week, and this channel currently isn't monetized at all. So just knowing that some people are out there hoping to see more helps to keep me going and create more. Am I saying that every like and every follower increases my odds of getting off my ass? Yes, I am. With all that said, I have been Nerdic, and I hope you all have a wonderful day.